All right, we're gonna try something new here and see how this works out. So bear with me here. Um, so this next unit that we're going to cover is basically from the revolutions in 1848 to 1914, the start of World War One. I'm just kind of go through this and let you kind of listen and take notes as you go. Obviously, you can pause, play it when you need more time on any individual slide, but the hopes is that you see it, you hear it, and you write it, and hopefully we'll be able to retain more through this unit. Okay, so let's just get into it. All right, let's talk about social changes, okay? Uh, One of the things that we're going to see socially is that because of changes in politics, um, people, poor people are going to get better treatment, both from a social welfare standpoint. Um, you have people like Bismarck in Germany. You have Napoleon III in France. Governments are going to start to extend welfare, like the means of a welfare state or social welfare programs in order to try to keep poor people happy, because when poor people are happy, or at least moderately happy, they don't revolt. Okay, and so things like Social Security, old age pensions, sickness or accident insurance, retirement benefits, um, those types of things are going to be created during this time period in order to try to keep revolutions down. Obviously, as the sort of negative effects of industrialization start to ramp up, and as society becomes more urbanized, um, governments are going to have to respond to this, mostly out of security measures. And so, this does have a social effect, though. So, like, poor people are going to get some sort of benefits from this, at least moderate benefits. I don't actually see this on here. One of the things you also should note is that many cities around Europe are going to be revamped, renovated. Like much of Paris is ripped down, and the city is totally redone. Same thing in like Vienna, for example, is and you might want to just pause this and kind of do a little bit more Google searches on this. Um, but they totally revamp and reorganize the city. One, to sort of alleviate the worst of like the slums that had developed in these cities, like the most dangerous, dark, dirty places in the city get torn down, and they do a better job of creating city parks. They widen roads. And the sort of modern city takes shape. We start to see better educated populace. By the time we get to the late 1800s, education had become mandatory in most countries, and so they expand access to education. They want a better educated populace because of an industrializing economy. They also understand that education is a good social control tool, so be aware of that. The society in the late 1800s is often characterized as like a society of mass leisure. So they're going to talk about like the chapters in this unit in the late 1800s are going to talk about sort of mass society. So it's mass leisure, it's mass consumption, it's mass production. That because of the growth in population, because of this sort of second wave of industrialization that takes place, this sort of like mass society develops, and that's something you really need to know. Now, the sort of social component of this, is like mass leisure, is that people are going to have more money because of the economic prosperity that comes with this second wave of industrialization. They're also going to have more free time because with the economy was able to produce more and using less working hours because of the influence of machinery and economic production. And so like there's people are making more money and they're having more leisure time, and so like the culture shifts because of that. So we start to see more theaters, dance halls. People go and listen to music, orchestras, comedies, not movies yet really, but sports too. Is that sports will become an important sort of leisure activity in the late 1800s. And I also think you should understand like the role that sports play because of growing nationalism during this time. So understand that like that nationalism piece, the mass leisure piece contributes to sort of like the beginning of professional sports kind of as we know it. They also have the first Olympic Games during this time period as well. Society is like we're still going to talk about social segregation being the norm. Still talking about really ridiculous inequalities and deplorable living conditions in cities, even though like there are important positive changes that are happening. But it's still much of the same in regards to that. Especially because population is going to boom during this time period. Which is going to contribute to a lot of these problems with overcrowding. Society is also like going to become much more commercialized and consumption based and materialistic. So especially in the middle class. So middle class culture, society that develops during this time period is going to be very materialistic. We're still talking about differences between men and women, okay? So even though that's going to start to change, people start to question the sort of conventional sex roles that had developed, and like there's this one part of this is like a sort of a cult of domesticity, which is something that you should know that there was this belief that the ideal woman was just sort of like the angel in the house, and she took care of everything in the house. And that she was sort of like the person who ran the home inside of the home, and that was her job, and that was like to be idealized. But this idea, especially in the lower classes, is going to be increasingly challenged. That women are going to start pushing for more equality as far as like more rights, especially politically, socially. We're talking about divorce. They're going to start really pushing strongly for women's suffrage, or women's right to vote. Women start to push for better education and jobs. They'd want to be included in professional schools, things like medical schools. They want to have more independent lifestyles. Okay. All right, let's talk about politics here. Okay, so in 1854, the Crimean War breaks out, and that's a war between Russia and the Ottomans over Russian claims in the Mediterranean Middle East, most notably around the Black Sea. And so that is obviously is still based on like current events, a very sort of hotly debated territory. Russia's going to lose. But the war really is important because it really breaks down the concert of Europe that had happened. It turns Austria and Russia into enemies. Both Russia and Great Britain after this, well, Russia because of embarrassment, but also Great Britain, they both enter sort of period of somewhat isolationism. Now that's going to change with the unification of Germany, but for the time being, this concert system that had developed in Europe in order to try to keep the peace the best they could is going to break down. So the Crimean War is kind of important, small conflict, but important conflict for a number of reasons. Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III, is going to encourage industrialization in France, and that's a really good example of like AP's asked questions before where they say, well, what like give an example of the role that like the state played in the spread of the Industrial Revolution around Europe, and in France you have a really good example of that because Louis Napoleon is going to use, or Napoleon III is going to use the government to subsidize the railroads, so like encourage building of the railroads. He's going to build harbors. The government's going to build roads and canals in order to encourage economic development. He's going to totally reconstruct Paris and improve living conditions, make it easier for commerce to happen. He's going to legalize trade unions, and he's going to open up government to as far as like encouraging like the growth of bureaucracy with skilled individuals. All right. With British politics, we see the division of political parties into kind of generalized here, like liberals and conservative group. We don't really see much influence of Marxism, which will have an influence on the politics in the continent. Um, Socialism is going to kind of embed itself into the growing democracy. You need to understand that uh, England's sort of venture into democratic government or semi-democratic government was very, very slow. Okay, so even with the Reform Bill of 1867, where you see more suffrage, um, that we're not close until like really the 1880s, into almost all males could vote. Um, but they cleaned up the rotten bureaus, which rotten bureaus were the districts to decide how many, like which area had how many how many representatives in the House of Commons gets redone, so that like the distribution of representatives between lower class people and upper class people becomes much more equal. They increased poor laws, which helped sort of quell like the worst parts of the inequalities that industrialization created. They did the Australian Ballot Act, which was like the secret ballot. Before that, when you voted, everyone would know who you voted for. And importantly, like in the period right before World War I, England really transforms into a social welfare state, and British politicians extend a number of important reforms in order to like help the poor in sort of a minimalistic way. The two big political events in this period, well, really one massive one is German unification, but Italian unification kind of mirrors this, so it's interesting to look at how the two are really connected in so many different ways. Um, and like I've told you repeatedly in class, German unification is like the defining moment of like the late 1800s, because German unification is what's going to cause almost all of the political changes and problems, or play some role in that as the 1900s or 20th century goes on. So what we see with this is that really starting in 1866 with the Austrian-Prussian War, the Austro-Prussian War, Italy and Prussia are going to unite. And this war is really important because Prussia is going to sort of put itself at the top of the German states and sort of like the power hierarchy that had developed amongst German states. Remember, Germany is this conglomeration of a bunch of independent states, and so Prussia beating Austria puts Prussia kind of on the top of that power ladder. Importantly, with Italy being aligned with Prussia here, is Italy got most of the Italian states became independent because it was Austria that was really in control of most of the Italian states. And so now after the Austrian-Prussian War, not only is Prussia sort of the top dog with Germany, or the German states, but all of Italy had come together except for Rome. Okay. Now the next part of that, or piece of that, is in 1870 with the Franco-Prussian War, is that France and Prussia go to war with each other. And so in this war, we see, the Prussians dominate France. And it's because Prussia is dominating France, the French government has to pull, Napoleon has to pull his troops out of Rome. And when he pulls his troops out of Rome, the Italian army goes in, they annex Rome, and Rome becomes the capital of the new Italian state. So in the Franco-Prussian War, we see not only Italy uniting, but we're also going to see the Germany finally united. And I'm actually seeing a typo on here, so that where that says 1877, that should say 1870. That's the Franco-Prussian War. So Germans are going to dominate. Napoleon III's government's going to collapse. William I becomes the first Kaiser of the Second German Reich. And so he actually forces William I becomes the first Kaiser of the Second German Republic, or sorry, Second German Empire, in Versailles. So in the Hall of Mirrors, which is an interesting little tidbit of history. And so Germany's going to become the most powerful country on the continent. Um, Germany makes France pay a huge fee, and they also gain Alsace and Lorraine, which were areas along the French and German border. So Franco-Prussian War, super important. Italian unification, more importantly though, that we see is German unification. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Russia. Okay, so Russia is still very much behind the rest of Europe. Their defeat in the Crimean War kind of highlights that. After the war, though, Russia begins to modernize, even though it's slow. It doesn't really take off until 1890s. But it is important that they do sort of start this process. In 1861, Alexander II is going to abolish serfdom, so they end slavery 4 years before we do, and created zemstvos, which were just like local governments in order to encourage sort of government reform in Russia. Now, so from 1850 to 1890, you see really sort of moderate, slow industrialization. You see some bits of society becoming more open and modernization sort of socially and politically. When we get to 1905, Russia's going to go to war with Japan. Russia's going to get embarrassed in a war again. This brings in a huge amount of political upheaval in Russia, and there's a series of revolutions that break out in 1905. And what's going to happen is the Tsar is going to sort of try to make compromises and say, well, hey, we're going to make reforms, and then they ultimately don't. And again, like this is important because it's only 12 years later that the socialist revolution is going to break out, communist revolution is going to break out in Russia. And a lot of that stems from the fact that, well, one, they're getting their butts kicked in World War I, but the overarching story is that they don't modernize, they don't liberalize, and because of that, they have a revolution and their government's overthrown. Sort of politically, if we talk about sort of the lead up to World War I, again, remember when I talk about sort of mass society, mass consumption, mass production. In politics, we do talk also about mass politics, okay? We're talking about the growth of nation states, okay? That like nationality becomes really important in defining like your boundaries, your political boundaries. It also is going to make competition between states much more fierce because they wanted to prove, especially once we get in the late 1800s with like the social Darwinism and like the pseudoscience that goes along with that, is that you have nation groups that are also like competing with each other to see, who is the best. Are German white people better than French white people? And like there's all of that goes with the social Darwinist thinking of the time. That's also like economic competition, right? So like they're going to compete with each other over sort of economic growth for the acquisition of colonies, especially because the second wave of the Industrial Revolution really is starting to have an effect. Bismarck's going to start a trade warfare between himself, France, and Britain. And so the first time we really see Britain and France become allies. They had been fighting sort of on and off for nearly 1,000 years at that point. So it's Germany. The unification of Germany is what finally brings France and Britain to become friends or allies. If we look at sort of like the features of mass politics, we're going to see the growth in male suffrage in Britain, France, and Germany. So like more people are going to be able to participate in politics, i.e. like the mass politics. We see new political parties that are going to represent a wider range of people's interests, mostly because there's more voters. So there's going to be more political parties to kind of gain the support of these new voters. We're going to see governments grow in order to like govern these growing populations. As the state becomes bigger, as far as population goes, there's going to need to be bigger government to control those growing populations, especially because governments are going to, in this period, start to expand social welfare programs to these poorer people, and so you need people to manage those programs. We also see with mass politics like the growth of like things that we kind of take for granted. So like free education that the state offers, social welfare programs, healthcare. Um, this is going to be important because it causes ordinary people to have more loyalty to their government or state, and that's kind of like the hallmark of politics at this time is you need to get people, you need to control people, but you need to get them to also choose to buy into that through the utilization of these programs, but also like through the sort of utilization of nationalism. All right. If we talk about some religious stuff here, so in 1870, one of the big sort of religious changes, Bismarck is going to attempt to delegitimize the Catholic Church in Germany. Mostly because like there was a big religious gap between northern Germans who were largely Protestants, mainly Lutherans, and southern Germans who were much more Catholic. This is one of the sort of parts of Bismarck's political reforms that really isn't very successful at all. But because on the sort of grander scale, I mean, Bismarck really is super successful. He brings Germany together once he's leader of Germany. He's able to increase the power of the state. He increases German imperialism. There's a bunch of things we'll talk about later on. This is one of those things that, like, if you get a paper about Bismarck, you want to ID that he's not successful here. There's the Dreyfus Affair in 1894 in France, where a Jewish captain is falsely accused and convicted of treason. This is sort of a reflection of like a greater anti-Semitic problem in Europe as a whole. And so I actually read a really interesting book like 2 summers ago that talked about how like the intellectualism that comes to like define Nazism really is rampant around Europe in the early 20th century, and so like this anti-Semitism was much more prevalent and popular than we like to talk about in history classes, and this is a good example of that. What's interesting is that like this particular incident in France is going to create a very strong like anti-organized religion movement. So like people start to see the Catholic Church and the problem of the Catholic Church that they're hateful and they're closed-minded, and what ends up happening because of like the push to get like that kind of Catholic doctrine out of France is that the government had to sever ties with the Catholic Church in France, and which was really important because at the time the government was using the Catholic Church to help with public schools, and so that's an important change. We just see in general like a declining religiosity throughout Europe, really except Sweden. Church attendance is less than 20% in major urban centers in Britain and France. So you have 1 in 5 people going to church. We also will talk more about Darwin, I think on the next slide. But like you should understand that Darwin, when he published his theories about evolution and natural selection, that's going to create more tension between religion and science. That is one of sort of the hallmarks of like the intellectualism of the late 1800s. And you see more and more educated people starting to kind of shift away from religion, unfortunately. So intellectual changes, okay? You're going to see new ideas with like Planck's quantas and Einstein's theory of relativity, which like AP is never going to ask you to know those 2 things in great detail. Even maybe you want to do a small Google search and kind of get the simple answer. But what's important here is like when Newton comes up with his ideas about science and the scientific revolution, like the way in which he understood science is that there was a natural law that controlled everything. So there's everything is controlled by like cause and effect, and that everything is like discoverable, and everything is like once you know one thing, like you just know about it. What and with Einstein here, what's really important is that like what we know to be truth might be different based on our position um, in the universe, and that like every like that there like Einstein like if you dig deep enough into like what Einstein's really saying is that there's like no eternal truths, like that just like whatever is your reality is based on like where you're at in the solar system, um, and so like that there is no absolute truth, and that like that undercut Newton's theories about this sort of cosmic clockmaker, and that like God had created this universe that is very rhythmic, and like everything can be understood by understanding like the natural laws that control those things. So like this period of intellectualism is sometimes classified as God, what am I trying to say? All right, sorry, I had some problems there. It's the age of anxiety. I'm hoping this keeps going. All right, moving on. Okay, so Nietzsche is important German intellectual. He's the one that argued like God is dead. He's gonna argue, that religion is dying. He's gonna there's a bunch of things he's going to argue about sort of Christian morality, and like how Christian morality, which he called slave morality, is a problem for society, because it basically holds us back from our potential greatness. One of the interesting ideas that I think he did have is he had this idea of like Superman, and that like and how this kind of fits is like like we'll go back to like Marx, and Marx thought that like there was like a dialectical process that explained history. Like Nietzsche thought that like Superman, so like that like big changes in history happened because like there was one person who sort of defined the age and like caused all of the change to happen. Like Napoleon, for example. Moving on, so like Freud. Um, what Freud is going to argue is that humans are rationalizers, not necessarily rational, so that we conceptualize irrational things into rational ways and make them sound like they are rational, but they're really not. So his ideas, well, like if you take a psych class, you'll learn much more about this. But what's interesting about Freud is that he's going to basically say that we are like sophisticated animals, that like we are like really basically driven by the same instincts that like animals are driven, but we just like society has placed like these norms on us. So you know we really are controlled by like the drive to have sex, stay alive, and have friends, and that like yeah, we make like a big fuss about like how civilized we are, but like everything we do is basically one of those three things. And so he's going to be really critical of human, achievement or progress. And so he's like very anti-enlightened in that sort of way. Darwin's theory is the origin of species and descent of man. So the first one he talks about natural selection. He doesn't necessarily talk about evolution of humans until he writes the Descent of Man. And so like we'll talk a lot about like natural selection. I'm sure you're already kind of familiar with that. So I'm trying to keep this on the more brief side. One of the big things about the intellectual changes is like the old like certitude about the world is gone. Like people lost like that sense of certainty. Like hey, like as long as we just kind of consistently keep progressing, that like we'll know everything, and that causes a lot of sort of panic in intellectuals. Like, well, what if we don't know it? And like, how do you feel safe and secure in a world in which is becoming less religious? We feel like we know less. Are we regressing? And so like that's a really interesting change. All right. We're gonna see here. I'm gonna move on to imperialism. I have 5 minutes to do this, so I'm gonna go fast. All right, so 19th century imperialism is really going to focus on Africa and Asia, like really China, and colonization of Africa. by 1800, European countries control 7% of the world's territory. That number is going to grow to 84%. So European countries, by the start of World War I, controlled 84% of the world territory. And England alone was at 25%. So that shows you the extent to which European countries, empires are going to grow. All right, imperialism is going to most, strongly be led by the British. If we look at causes, okay, so we see industrialization is going to cause an increase for demand for natural resources that weren't indigenous to Europe. So like rubber, petroleum, palm oil, manganese. Most importantly, those are things that you need to sort of furnace the industrial technologies, make steel, rubber for tires. Two, you also have increasing demand for new markets. Okay, so like they need to be able to have more places to sell extra goods. We also see like not only just natural resources but products that aren't indigenous to Europe, so like coffee and sugar, cocoa and tea, peanuts, for example. And then like the fourth one is important, especially because you need to understand is that battleships at the time were coal powered, and so like you couldn't just like sail around the world. You needed to have coaling stations for your navy to be able to refuel. And then five, social Darwinism. Is that this really honestly is more of a justification. So like this is less of a cause and more of a way in which people are able to justify their economic exploitation of Africa and Asia. If we look at things that sort of help this, is that Europeans had too much military technology. So we see the first Maxim guns, steel ships against a very fractured Africa that had too much diversity. So like that's a bad thing. But in this case, it was a bad thing because Africans, tribes weren't able to come together in any sort of significant way to be able to stop European expansionism. And what really is going to cause a big change in this is that when Germany is unified in 1870, is that they begin to start pushing for African colonies. And so what ends up happening is this called like the Scramble for Africa. And they call a conference in Berlin in 1884, 1885, where European countries basically sit down in a conference and they sort of talk amongst themselves and like carve up Europe into different chunks. And so like no African countries were there. America wasn't invited, but these major European powers basically sit down and carve up Africa. All right. We've talked a lot about opium wars, so I'll just kind of leave it at that. If you want to talk about sort of scientific improvements with technology, you'd really want to talk about pasteurization. We see the first, basically germ theory before it was called germ theory. We'll get more into that, so I'm just going to kind of skip through that quickly. And then the second industrial revolution case, this is where I'm going to spend the most amount of time here. Bessemer process. Okay, you need to know Bessemer process. You're able to mass produce steel very quickly and cheaply. We're going to see coal and steam power give way to electricity and oil and gasoline powered engines, which are much more efficient. We see the invention of the telephone, and it's going to replace the telegraph. Germany is going to replace Britain as sort of the chief European industrial power. And like I have that stat there, by 1900, Germany is going to produce more steel than Great Britain and France combined. You also see America starting really to push here. This is going to cause an immense amount of like economic prosperity. So the money from this industrial prosperity is really going to filter throughout society. This creates a large middle class, and so like we start to see much like a very significant middle class culture develop, and it's going to be based on consumption and materialism, which also helps play it into a need for colonies. This consumerism and consumption of unique things, right? Because that was like the hallmark. Like I have these products that are hard to get, that are unique and rare. We see for the first time in the late 1800s department stores open, which helps lead to more mass production, which leads to drop in prices, which leads to better products for all classes. We also see just more consumption from this. So mass production, mass consumption kind of play hand in hand. We see the first sort of catalogs getting spread throughout Europe to order things. We see food becoming cheaper as a result of all these changes. And that's kind of a simplification, but I'm trying to go fast and finish. With art, if you want to look up some of this stuff, I'll just kind of put it here. But this is, you're going to do a project on this over Mardi Gras, so I'm not real worried about it.